Hi there. Tonight we delve into the intricate, often challenging landscape of Victorian marriage, focusing specifically on the role and behavior of the man. Imagine yourself as a Victorian husband, perhaps stepping through the front door of your tastefully appointed home after a long day of work. You shed your hat and coat, a sense of quiet authority settling upon you. This house, its contents, and the people within it are, in a very real sense, your domain. Your wife awaits, ready, to ensure your comfort and attend to your needs. This isn't just a partnership as we might understand it today. It's a hierarchy carefully constructed and legally sanctioned. You probably wouldn't survive a single day in this role without a top hat and a deeply ingrained sense of paternalistic duty. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. From the moment you utter your vows, your position as husband, as head, legal and moral authority is cemented not just by tradition, but by the very laws of the land. In the Victorian era, particularly for much of its duration, the husband was the undisputed patriarch of the household. English common law, through the doctrine of coverture, which we've touched upon before, remember that idea of the wife's legal identity being covered by yours, effectively merged your wife's legal existence with your own upon marriage. This meant that in the eyes of the law, she ceased to be a feme soul, a single woman with her own legal rights, and became a feme covert, a covered woman, utterly subservient to your will. You held legal control over all property, earnings, and even inherited wealth that she brought into the marriage or acquired during it. Your word was final in all matters pertaining to the family, where you lived, how your children were educated, and even with whom your wife could associate. This mainstream historical fact, the husband's supreme legal and moral authority within the Victorian household, was the cornerstone of the marital relationship and dictated how you, as a husband, were expected to treat your wife. Historians still argue whether this absolute legal authority was primarily a reflection of deeply ingrained patriarchal values designed to subjugate women, or if it was also viewed by contemporaries as a necessary framework for maintaining social order and stability in a rapidly industrializing society. It's a bit like trying to run a very large, complicated machine with only one operator. The Victorians believed a single, clear hand on the tiller was essential to prevent chaos. You might genuinely believe you were acting in your family's best interests, making decisions that you felt were for their protection and prosperity, even if those decisions sometimes limited your wife's autonomy. You carried the heavy burden of being the sole public face and decision-maker for your entire domestic unit. Here's a quirky tidbit. To underscore your authority, it was common for wives to address their husbands as Mr. St. husband's surname, even in private, or to use formal titles like my dear, rather than a more intimate first name, especially in front of others. Imagine the quiet formality, even in your most intimate moments, constantly reinforcing the social hierarchy. The quiet expectation of deference, the understanding that your word was final in all matters, meant that your wife's role was largely one of obedience and support. Your responsibility was to provide, protect, and govern, while your wife's was to manage the domestic sphere you created and to obey your directives. This profound imbalance of power, legally codified and socially enforced, defined the very essence of how Victorian husbands were expected to treat their wives, placing you, the husband, squarely at the authoritative head of the household. As the undisputed head of the household, your authority came with a weighty responsibility. defining another crucial aspect of how you treated your wife. Your role as the financial provider, sole breadwinner role. Imagine yourself leaving your home each morning, briefcase in hand, perhaps heading to an office, a factory, or a law court. The entire economic well-being of your family rested squarely on your shoulders, and this immense pressure shaped your interactions and expectations within the marriage. You see, Victorian society, especially among the middle and upper classes, rigidly adhered to the separate spheres ideology. Your sphere, as the man, was the public one, the world of commerce, industry, politics, and finance. Your wife's sphere was the private one, the home. This meant that you, and you alone, were responsible for generating all the income necessary to support your family, to pay for the rent or mortgage, put food on the table, purchase clothing, fund your children's education, and maintain your household's social standing. Your wife, by societal expectation, was largely barred from paid employment, her duties confined to managing the household efficiently with the resources you provided. This mainstream historical fact, the husband's singular role as the family's financial provider, was a fundamental pillar of Victorian marriage and profoundly influenced the husband's treatment of his wife. Historians still argue whether this singular responsibility for provision primarily empowered men by giving them ultimate control, or if it also placed an unbearable psychological and economic burden on them, leading to immense stress and potentially harsh expectations of their wives. It's a bit like being the only chef in a very busy restaurant. You have all the control over the menu, but also all the stress when things go wrong. You might feel the constant pressure of financial success, knowing that your family's comfort and respectability depended entirely on your ability to earn. This pressure could manifest in your demeanor, perhaps making you demanding of your wife in terms of household economy or management. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some advice manuals for young men explicitly warned against marrying a woman who might be too extravagant, emphasizing that her financial management, or lack thereof, could literally bankrupt you and ruin your reputation. Imagine selecting your life partner based largely on her perceived frugality. The quiet hum of the market, the clatter of industry, or the hushed negotiations of business filled your days, all in service of this crucial responsibility. Your capacity to provide was not just a personal skill, it was a defining characteristic of your masculinity and a direct measure of your success as a husband. This unwavering commitment to your role as the sole breadwinner dictated many of your interactions with your wife, solidifying your position as the ultimate authority figure in the financial landscape of your shared life. The legal and financial authority you wielded as a Victorian husband came hand in hand with another crucial expectation, that of protector of the home, shielding from outside. Imagine yourself standing in the doorway of your home, perhaps on a stormy night, a sense of quiet vigilance settling upon you. You were not just the provider, but the shield, the bulwark against any threat to your family's physical safety, social standing, or reputation. You see, Victorian society, while often romanticized today, could be a harsh and unpredictable place. As the husband, you were expected to defend your wife and children from any danger, be it physical violence, financial ruin, or social scandal. This extended beyond mere physical protection. You were responsible for ensuring your wife's reputation remained untarnished, carefully controlling her interactions with the outside world. Any perceived impropriety on her part would reflect directly on you, damaging your standing in the community. You were also expected to manage the family's finances prudently, shielding them from economic hardship. This mainstream historical fact, the husband's role as the protector of his family's physical safety, financial security, and social reputation, was a core component of his marital duties. Historians still argue whether this expectation of protection primarily empowered men, reinforcing their dominance, or if it also placed a significant burden on them, creating anxiety about their ability to adequately safeguard their families. It's a bit like being the captain of a ship in a storm. You have the authority but also the responsibility for the safety of everyone on board. You might feel a constant, low-level worry about your wife's well-being, her reputation, or the family's financial security, knowing that any failure in these areas would be seen as a direct reflection of your inadequacy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some husbands would even carry small firearms, like pocket pistols, not just for personal defense, but as a visible symbol of their ability to protect their families from potential threats. Imagine having a tiny, ornate gun as an accessory, a constant reminder of your protective duty. The quiet creak of the front door closing behind you, the watchful gaze you cast upon your family, and the careful management of your finances all spoke to this fundamental role. Your strength, both literal and figurative, was the bulwark upon which your family's security rested. This expectation of unwavering protection shaped your interactions with your wife, reinforcing your authority and solidifying your position as the ultimate guardian of your shared world. Given your absolute authority as the protector and provider, a fundamental expectation shaped how you treated your wife, her wife's submission, expectation of deference. Imagine your wife greeting you at the door, her posture perhaps slightly deferential, her words respectful. This wasn't merely good manners, it was a societal and often personal expectation that her will would yield to yours in all significant matters, ensuring domestic harmony under your command. You see, Victorian society upheld a clear hierarchy within marriage, with the husband at the apex. The wife's role, idealized as the angel in the house, was fundamentally one of support, nurturing, and obedience to her husband. She was expected to defer to your judgment, particularly in matters concerning finances, external affairs, and the children's ultimate upbringing. While she managed the domestic realm, your decisions were final. This expectation of submission was often framed not as subjugation, but as a reciprocal duty. You provided and protected, and she in turn created a harmonious home by deferring to your leadership. This mainstream historical fact, the societal expectation of a wife's deference and submission to her husband's authority, was a bedrock principle of Victorian marital relations. Historians still argue whether this expectation of female submission was primarily a natural outcome of societal roles and perceived gender differences, or if it was a deliberate mechanism for maintaining male power and control in an era of rapid social change. It's a bit like having a conductor for an orchestra. The music sounds harmonious, but only if everyone follows the conductor's lead, even if they have their own ideas about the tempo. You might, as a husband, expect your wife to consult you on all major decisions, to manage the household according to your wishes, and to present a united, deferential front to the outside world, subtly reinforcing your patriarchal position. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian etiquette guides for young women explicitly advise them on how to politely, yet firmly, disagree with a husband in private, suggesting that public dissent was a grave offense to his dignity and authority. Imagine having to carefully plan your arguments to ensure they were never overheard or misinterpreted as outright defiance. The quiet nods, the respectful silence, and the unspoken understanding that your word was paramount defined many of your daily interactions with your wife. This pervasive expectation of deference shaped how you treated your wife, often fostering a relationship where your commands were followed and her opinions, while potentially voiced privately, were ultimately subordinate to your final decision. Your treatment of her was often paternalistic, guiding her actions within the sphere you deemed appropriate for her. While your authority as a Victorian husband was absolute and deference from your wife expected, the prevailing societal norms often dictated a certain restraint in how you expressed your personal feelings. This brings us to emotional distancing, reserved affection. Imagine yourself in your drawing room, perhaps after a long day. Your wife might sit across from you, diligently engaged in needlework, and while a quiet affection might exist, overt displays of emotion, particularly passion or overt sentimentality, were often considered unmanly and inappropriate. You see, Victorian masculinity emphasized stoicism, rationality, and self-control. Public displays of emotion, especially for men, were generally frowned upon. This extended into the private sphere of marriage. While a deep, abiding love and respect were considered desirable within a union, outward expressions of passion, tenderness, or vulnerability were often reserved, subtle, and perhaps only truly expressed in the most private moments, if at all. The ideal husband was seen as a steady, reliable anchor, not a demonstrative romantic. His affection might be shown through diligent provision, steadfast protection, and quiet companionship, rather than through passionate declarations or frequent embraces. This mainstream historical fact, the societal expectation of emotional reserve, particularly from men, within Victorian marriages, shaped the way husbands treated their wives, often leading to a more formal and less outwardly affectionate dynamic. Historians still argue whether this emotional distancing truly inhibited intimacy and emotional connection within Victorian marriages, or if it simply led to more subtle, unspoken forms of affection and understanding that were nonetheless profound. It's a bit like deciding if a very British stiff upper lip truly means a lack of feeling, or just a different way of showing it. You might find yourself communicating your care for your wife through actions, providing a comfortable home, ensuring her financial security, or supporting her charitable endeavors, rather than through effusive words, believing these practical demonstrations were the true hallmarks of a devoted husband. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian couples communicated affection through highly symbolic gifts like lockets containing strands of hair, or elaborate floral arrangements where each flower carried a specific, coded meaning from the language of flowers. Imagine sending your wife a bouquet where every bloom conveyed a secret message of love you wouldn't dare utter aloud. The quiet companionship, the unspoken understanding, and the subtle gestures often replaced overt emotional expression. Your treatment of your wife, therefore, was likely characterized by a reserved affection, where deep feelings might exist, but were rarely given public or even consistently private, vocal expression, adhering instead to a prevailing ideal of masculine, emotional control. Stemming directly from your legal authority and financial provision, your power as a Victorian husband extended to virtually every asset your wife possessed. This brings us to property control, coverture's grasp. Imagine your wife inheriting a sum of money from a distant relative, or perhaps having saved some earnings from before your marriage. Under the law, that money, those assets, automatically became yours, a testament to your absolute dominion. You see, for the majority of the Victorian era, the legal doctrine of coverture was ruthlessly effective in placing all marital property under the husband's control. Any real estate, personal property, or money that your wife brought into the marriage or that she acquired during it, whether through inheritance, gifts, or her own earnings if she had any, legally belonged to you. She could not sell it, manage it, or even gift it without your consent. Your control was so absolute that you could theoretically squander her inheritance, sell her family heirlooms, or dictate how her earnings were spent, even if it was against her wishes. This mainstream historical fact, the husband's complete legal control over his wife's property under coverture, was a defining characteristic of Victorian marriage and profoundly shaped how husbands treated their wives financially. Historians still argue whether the legal system of coverture was primarily designed to ensure family unity and prevent fragmentation of assets, or if it was a patriarchal tool that systematically disempowered women and facilitated male financial dominance. It's a bit like giving one person all the cards in a game. It might make the game simpler, but it certainly isn't fair. You might genuinely believe you were acting as the prudent manager of your household's wealth, consolidating all assets for the family's greater good, even if your wife felt a quiet despair at her lack of financial autonomy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Wealthy families, eager to protect their daughters' inheritances from potentially dissolute or incompetent sons-in-law, often resorted to complex legal maneuvers like establishing marriage settlements or trusts, which would hold the wife's property outside the husband's control. Imagine having to construct an elaborate legal fortress just to prevent your son-in-law from gambling away your daughter's fortune. The quiet weight of financial dependency, the understanding that every shilling, every piece of furniture, every family heirloom was legally yours to command, defined a significant aspect of your marital power. Your treatment of your wife in this financial realm was often akin to that of a benevolent, or sometimes not so benevolent, manager of her entire material existence, a constant reminder of her legal and economic subservience. Rooted in your role as the undisputed head of the household and protector, your authority as a Victorian husband even extended to the right to enforce order within your domestic sphere. This brings us to discipline and correction, legal chastisement. Imagine a scene where your wife has perhaps made a significant household error or defied your wishes. The legal framework of the time, shocking as it sounds today, granted you a limited, albeit real, right to physically correct her behavior. You see, for much of the Victorian era, English common law still contained remnants of ancient legal traditions that allowed a husband to administer moderate personal chastisement to his wife. While the specifics were vague and the practice increasingly frowned upon as the century progressed, particularly among the middle and upper classes, the legal precedent technically existed. This wasn't about severe beating, which was generally illegal and socially condemned, but a husband might claim the right to use a stick no thicker than his thumb or a similar light implement to enforce obedience. This underlying legal principle, even if rarely exercised in its most extreme form by respectable men, subtly reinforced the husband's position as the ultimate disciplinarian within the home. This mainstream historical fact, the lingering legal allowance for a husband to chastise his wife, however moderately, underscored his absolute authority and influenced the power dynamic within the marriage. Historians still argue whether the legal right to chastisement was primarily a dead letter, rarely invoked by most husbands, or if its very existence provided a psychological deterrent that ensured female submission and reinforced the husband's dominance. It's a bit like having a very old, dusty rule book that no one actively follows anymore, but whose existence still casts a long shadow over the proceedings. You might never lift a hand to your wife, believing it barbaric, but the unspoken understanding of your ultimate authority, backed by law, might still be a subtle force in your interactions, ensuring your will was rarely openly challenged. Here's a quirky tidbit. By the later Victorian period, police were increasingly intervening in cases of severe domestic violence, and public opinion was turning sharply against any form of physical chastisement, showing a gradual erosion of this ancient right. Imagine the quiet discomfort of seeing a neighbor's argument spill onto the street, knowing that the law was slowly but surely shifting to protect wives from even moderate correction. The quiet assertion of your authority, the expectation that your decisions would be respected without question, and the legal framework that, however subtly, underpinned your right to maintain order, shaped how you treated your wife. Even if you never physically corrected her, the latent power implicit in this historical context informed your overall approach to managing your household and securing your wife's obedience. Beyond the private realm of your home and the direct interactions with your wife, your conduct as a Victorian husband was also intensely scrutinized by society, defining another key aspect of how you treated her: social reputation, public image, management. Imagine yourself attending a social gathering, your arm linked with your wife's, acutely aware that every gesture, every interaction, and every word, spoken or unspoken, contributed to the meticulously constructed facade of your family's respectability. Your wife's demeanor, her attire, even her quietness, directly reflected upon you. You see, for Victorian society, particularly among the middle and upper classes, maintaining a pristine public image was paramount. Your marriage was not just a private union. It was a public institution, a visible representation of your moral character and social standing. As the husband, you were the public face of the family, and your wife's behavior and presentation were seen as a direct extension of your management and control. Any perceived impropriety on her part, a hint of extravagance, a breach of etiquette, or even a fleeting rumor could swiftly tarnish your family's reputation and, by extension, your own business prospects and social standing. Therefore, you were expected to ensure your wife upheld the highest standards of decorum, both in her person and in her management of the household. This mainstream historical fact, the intense societal pressure on husbands to manage their family's public reputation, largely through their wife's conduct, profoundly influenced how they treated their wives in public and private. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on public image primarily created a suffocating environment of hypocrisy and pretense, or if it also fostered a strong sense of collective responsibility and shared social ambition within the family unit. It's a bit like being constantly on stage. Every movement is for an audience, and there's immense pressure to perform flawlessly. You might find yourself subtly correcting your wife's posture, offering a polite but firm reminder about a social engagement, or even monitoring her conversations to ensure she didn't inadvertently let slip any unsuitable information. All in the service of maintaining that impeccable facade. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very status-conscious Victorian husbands would even dictate their wives' fashion choices, ensuring their attire was always appropriate for their social standing and never too flamboyant or revealing, lest it invite unwanted gossip. Imagine your wardrobe being approved by your husband, not just for style, but for its adherence to strict societal rules. The quiet performance of domestic bliss, the seamless execution of social graces, and the constant vigilance over public perception were not just your wife's duties, they were a joint project, implicitly managed by you as the head of the household. Your treatment of her was often geared towards ensuring she remained the perfect angel in the house, a living testament to your respectability and success, both within the home and in the unforgiving gaze of Victorian society. While a spotless public reputation was paramount, the strictures of Victorian morality often applied very differently to husbands than to wives, especially when it came to personal conduct. This brings us to infidelity, the double standard. Imagine you, a Victorian husband, perhaps having an extramarital affair. While such an act by your wife would bring utter ruin and social ostracism, your own indiscretions, though technically condemned, were often met with a starkly different, more tolerant, and even complicit silence from society. You see, Victorian society operated under a profound sexual double standard. For a wife, any hint of infidelity was a catastrophic moral failure that could lead to divorce, loss of children, and complete social condemnation, stripping her of all respectability. For a husband, however, while adultery was not openly condoned, it was frequently tolerated, especially if discreet and with women of a lower social class, like prostitutes, whom we discussed earlier. Male sexual urges were often seen as stronger and more difficult to control, making their transgressions more understandable if not entirely excusable. The consequences for a husband's infidelity were far less severe. He rarely faced legal or social ruin unless the affair became a public scandal that threatened his family's reputation or led to significant financial or social embarrassment. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive sexual double standard, that excused male infidelity while condemning female infidelity, profoundly shaped how husbands treated their wives, both privately and in terms of their own behavior. Historians still argue whether this double standard was primarily a reflection of deeply ingrained patriarchal power structures, allowing men to control female sexuality while indulging their own, or if it was also a pragmatic societal acceptance of male natural urges that provided a necessary outlet for them outside the family unit. It's a bit like having a hidden back door to a very strict establishment. Some are allowed to use it, while others face severe punishment for even thinking about it. You might, as a husband, maintain an air of strict propriety in your home, demanding absolute fidelity from your wife, while quietly indulging in affairs, knowing that your social circle would likely look the other way or simply turn a blind eye as long as appearances were maintained. Here's a quirky tidbit. To further protect male reputations, cases of male infidelity that did come to public attention were often meticulously downplayed by the press, focusing instead on the perceived moral failings of the other woman, rather than the husband's culpability. Imagine the newspapers subtly shifting blame away from the philandering husband onto the unfortunate woman he was involved with. The quiet hypocrisy, the unspoken understanding that different rules applied, meant that your treatment of your wife might involve a tacit demand for absolute fidelity, while your own life was lived under a far more lenient moral code. This profound imbalance in expectations was a stark reality of many Victorian marriages, creating a complex and often painful dynamic for wives who lived under its shadow. While your wife was expected to be the primary caretaker for young children, your role as a Victorian husband certainly included specific duties regarding the next generation. This brings us to your paternal role, fatherhood's responsibilities. Imagine yourself spending an evening in the nursery, perhaps reading aloud to your children, or later guiding your sons through academic lessons or preparing them for their future professions. Your engagement might be less hands-on than your wife's, but it was profoundly important in shaping their moral character and future prospects. You see, a Victorian father was expected to be the moral head of the family, providing guidance, discipline, and setting an example of integrity. While your wife handled the day-to-day care and early education, you were typically responsible for the more serious aspects of your children's upbringing, especially for your sons. This included overseeing their formal education, choosing their schools, and preparing them for their entry into the public world of work. For daughters, you would ensure their proper social upbringing and eventual marriage. Your presence, even if often distant due to your work, was meant to be an authoritative and respected one. This mainstream historical fact, the Victorian husband's role as the moral and educational guide, particularly for his children's long-term future, was a significant aspect of his relationship with his family. Historians still argue whether this often aloof paternal role truly fostered respect and strong character in children, or if it sometimes led to emotional distance and a fear of the father figure. It's a bit like a general commanding troops. They might respect his authority, but they might not feel a personal connection. You might find yourself delivering stern lectures on duty and responsibility, offering advice on business matters, or perhaps engaging in more gentle, but still instructive, activities like a game of chess, always with an eye towards their moral and intellectual development. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian fathers would keep meticulous journals detailing their children's progress, their perceived character flaws and plans for their future, almost like a detailed strategic document for their offspring's lives. Imagine planning your child's entire future career path and finding a suitable spouse for them, all meticulously recorded in a private ledger. The quiet authority of your voice, the moments of shared learning, and the firm, but hopefully fair, hand of discipline defined your paternal role. Your treatment of your wife was often implicitly linked to her success in raising children who reflected well on your family, placing a shared, but often distinct, burden of responsibility on both of you for the next generation's success. Your extensive responsibilities as a Victorian husband, particularly your role as the sole financial provider and paterfamilias, dictated much of your daily schedule and, by extension, how you interacted with your wife. This brings us to work-life balance. Demands of profession. Imagine your typical weekday. Waking early, often before your wife, consuming a hearty breakfast, and then departing for your place of work, where you would remain for long, demanding hours, often until late evening. You see, for middle and upper-class Victorian men, professional life was all-consuming. Whether you were a merchant, a lawyer, a doctor, a civil servant, or a factory owner, your days were typically very long, often beginning early in the morning and extending well into the evening. Commuting, office hours, client meetings, business, dinners, and professional networking left little time for domestic life. The ideal of the diligent, hard-working man who put his career first was deeply ingrained. Your professional success was directly tied to your family's social standing and comfort, making your commitment to work paramount. This mainstream historical fact, the immense demands of a Victorian husband's profession and the long hours spent away from home, significantly shaped the limited time and nature of his interactions with his wife. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on male professional life primarily created emotionally distant fathers and husbands, or if it was a necessary sacrifice that ensured the family's survival and upward mobility in a competitive era. It's a bit like choosing to build a very tall tower. It requires immense effort and time, and the builder is often far removed from the ground below. You might return home exhausted, perhaps seeking quiet and respite, and your interactions with your wife would likely be framed around the day's events, household management, or the children's well-being, rather than extended periods of leisure or emotional intimacy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian gentlemen's clubs served as virtual second homes for professional men, offering dining, reading rooms, and social spaces where they could spend evenings networking or relaxing without returning to their families until very late. Imagine having an entire establishment dedicated to ensuring you didn't have to go home too early. The quiet solitude of your study or the bustling noise of your workplace dominated your waking hours, leaving your wife to manage the domestic sphere largely independently. Your treatment of your wife was often shaped by the exhaustion and mental absorption of your professional life, leading to a dynamic where her primary role was to create a haven of peace and order for your return, rather than to engage in extended, shared leisure. Given the immense demands of your professional life, your direct participation in the daily workings of the household was, for most Victorian husbands, markedly limited. This brings us to domestic involvement, limited engagement. Imagine your wife meticulously managing the household, overseeing servants, or perhaps personally tending to children, while you, the husband, remained largely removed from these daily intricacies, your presence primarily as an observer or a decision-maker on major issues. You see, the separate spheres ideology dictated that the domestic realm was primarily the wife's domain. Your role was to provide the financial means for its operation, and to be its ultimate authority, but not necessarily to engage in its day-to-day management. You might take breakfast and dinner at home, but your involvement in household chores, meal preparation, childcare beyond moral guidance, or supervising servants was minimal. Your wife was expected to handle these matters efficiently and discreetly, ensuring the home was a haven of peace and order for your return from the arduous public sphere. This mainstream historical fact, the largely hands-off approach of Victorian husbands to domestic management, defined the boundaries of their daily marital interactions. Historians still argue whether this limited domestic involvement primarily fostered a more efficient division of labor, allowing both husband and wife to specialize in their respective spheres, or if it created a sense of isolation and burden for wives who bore the full weight of domestic responsibility. It's a bit like running a company where the CEO never visits the factory floor. The business might still run, but there's a distinct lack of direct engagement with the daily operations. You might find yourself offering general instructions or making grand pronouncements about household matters, but rarely rolling up your sleeves to assist with a broken hinge or a crying infant. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some very traditional Victorian husbands would even avoid the kitchen entirely, believing it to be a strictly feminine space, and would never step foot in it, even if a servant wasn't immediately available to fetch something. Imagine feeling physically uncomfortable crossing the threshold of your own kitchen. The quiet order of the home, the seamless operation of domestic life, was largely a testament to your wife's ceaseless efforts, often performed without your direct input or even full awareness of the intricacies involved. Your treatment of your wife, in this context, was often based on the assumption that she would effortlessly manage the household, leaving you free to focus on your professional and public duties, reinforcing the traditional gender roles that defined Victorian marriage. Despite the rigid structures and traditional expectations, a subtle shift was beginning to emerge in the later Victorian era, influencing how some husbands treated their wives beyond mere duty. This brings us to the companionate ideal. Emerging affection. Imagine you, a Victorian husband, perhaps finding yourself increasingly valuing your wife not just as a manager of your home or the mother of your children, but as a confidant, a friend, and an intellectual equal within the confines of your shared domesticity. You see, while the primary purpose of marriage remained procreation and social stability, the Victorian era also saw the slow rise of the companionate marriage ideal. This ideal emphasized mutual affection, shared interests, and intellectual companionship between husband and wife. It didn't replace the patriarchal hierarchy entirely, but it softened its edges, encouraging men to view their wives as partners in life's journey, not just subordinates. This meant spending more time together in the evenings, engaging in shared hobbies like reading aloud, playing music, or discussing current events. It represented a move away from purely duty-based relationships towards those built on a foundation of genuine fondness and shared experience. This mainstream historical fact, the gradual emergence of the companionate marriage ideal, influenced how some Victorian husbands treated their wives, fostering more affectionate and intellectually engaging relationships. Historians still argue whether the companionate ideal was primarily a genuine evolution in gender relations, offering women greater emotional fulfillment, or if it was simply a subtle adaptation of patriarchal control, making the domestic sphere more appealing for men without fundamentally altering power dynamics. It's a bit like a very strict headmaster suddenly deciding to allow a few more extracurricular clubs. It might make school more enjoyable, but the rules are still the same. You might find yourself seeking out your wife's opinion on a book you were reading, discussing a political development, or simply enjoying a quiet evening of shared silence, finding solace and companionship in her presence. Here's a quirky tidbit. By the turn of the century, some progressive advice manuals even suggested that husbands and wives should cultivate shared intellectual pursuits, like learning a new language together or discussing philosophical texts, as a way to deepen their marital bond. Imagine your evening date night involving a deep dive into Kant. The quiet moments of shared reading, the murmur of affectionate conversation, and the subtle gestures of mutual respect began to redefine the marital relationship. Your treatment of your wife in this evolving context might increasingly emphasize partnership and intellectual camaraderie, creating a bond that, while still constrained by societal norms, offered a deeper emotional connection than mere duty could provide. This emerging ideal gently reshaped the landscape of how some Victorian husbands treated their wives, adding layers of affection and friendship to the foundation of authority and provision. Even as the companionate ideal began to soften some edges, the pervasive societal emphasis on decorum and hierarchy still dictated the manner in which husbands and wives interacted, particularly in public. This brings us to communication styles, indirect and formal. Imagine you, a Victorian husband, conversing with your wife, perhaps at a dinner party or even in the privacy of your home. Your words would be carefully chosen, your tone measured, and direct expressions of strong emotion or disagreement largely avoided, all in the service of maintaining a respectable facade. You see, Victorian society placed a high premium on politeness, propriety, and controlled emotional expression. This extended to marital communication. Husbands and wives were expected to communicate with decorum, avoiding open conflict, loud arguments, or anything that might suggest disharmony in the household. Discussions about sensitive topics such as finances, discipline, or personal dissatisfactions were often conducted indirectly, using euphemisms, subtle hints, or through intermediaries like notes or even trusted servants. Public displays of affection or disagreement were unheard of, as they would undermine the carefully cultivated image of a harmonious and respectable household. This mainstream historical fact, the prevalent use of indirect and formal communication styles within Victorian marriages, profoundly shaped the daily interactions between husbands and wives. Historians still argue whether this formality primarily led to emotional suppression and unspoken resentments, or if it fostered a more refined and thoughtful mode of interaction, encouraging diplomacy and preventing overt conflict. It's a bit like playing a game of chess. Every move is deliberate, and you try to anticipate your opponent's response rather than simply shouting your intentions. You might find yourself subtly guiding a conversation, dropping hints about your wishes, or perhaps exchanging knowing glances with your wife rather than engaging in direct demands, ensuring that the appearance of domestic tranquility was always maintained. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian couples even used calling cards to communicate within their own homes, leaving a card on a dressing table or study door as a polite signal for a desired conversation or to indicate a request for privacy. Imagine leaving a formal card for your own spouse just to ask for a chat. The quiet murmur of polite conversation, the careful avoidance of sensitive topics in mixed company, and the subtle art of implication defined much of your verbal exchange. Your treatment of your wife, in terms of communication, was likely characterized by a formal politeness, where respect for decorum often outweighed immediate emotional expression, contributing to a sense of order and control, even if it sometimes came at the cost of genuine openness. Despite the prevailing ideals of marital harmony and the gentle shift towards companionate marriages, the legal and social framework of the Victorian era presented formidable barriers to ending an unhappy union. This brings us to divorce barriers, legal and social traps. Imagine you, a Victorian husband, contemplating a separation from your wife due to irreconcilable differences, or perhaps her infidelity. The path to freedom was not only legally arduous but socially ruinous, making it an option only for the most desperate or wealthy. You see, for most of the Victorian period, divorce was exceedingly difficult and expensive, almost exclusively the preserve of the very rich. Prior to the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a full divorce required a private Act of Parliament, a process so costly and time-consuming that it was effectively out of reach for all but a handful of the wealthiest individuals. Even after 1857, while civil divorce became theoretically possible, the grounds were still unequal. A husband could petition for divorce on the sole ground of his wife's adultery, but a wife had to prove adultery plus an additional offense like cruelty, desertion, or bigamy. Furthermore, a public divorce case was a scandalous affair that brought immense shame upon both parties and their families, regardless of who was at fault. This mainstream historical fact, the extreme legal difficulty and social stigma associated with divorce, meant that most Victorian husbands and wives were effectively trapped in their marriages, regardless of their happiness. Historians still argue whether the extreme difficulty of divorce primarily forced couples to work through their problems and maintain family stability, or if it trapped countless individuals in miserable and even abusive relationships leading to hidden suffering and hypocrisy. It's a bit like having a lock on a cage that's nearly impossible to open. The animals might stay put, but they're not necessarily content. You might find yourself quietly enduring an unhappy marriage, prioritizing your family's reputation and your own financial stability over personal contentment, knowing that the public humiliation of divorce would far outweigh any private satisfaction. Here's a quirky tidbit. Couples who couldn't afford or pursue a legal divorce sometimes resorted to informal separations, or even, in very rare and desperate instances, wife sales in public markets, a barbaric and illegal custom that persisted in some rural areas despite being utterly without legal standing. Imagine actually trying to sell your wife in a market as a crude, desperate way to end your marriage. The quiet endurance of unhappy unions, the unspoken resentments, and the pervasive fear of social scandal meant that for many Victorian husbands, their treatment of their wives, even in dysfunctional relationships, was dictated by a lack of viable escape routes. The enduring legal and social barriers to divorce created a profound sense of permanence, shaping how husbands treated their wives as lifelong, albeit sometimes unwilling, companions. Beneath the idealized veneer of Victorian domesticity, and despite the barriers to divorce, the reality for some wives was a far darker experience. This brings us to alcoholism and abuse, hidden realities. Imagine a home where the quiet order is shattered by drunken outbursts, verbal cruelty, or even physical violence. For some Victorian women, their husband's treatment went far beyond mere patriarchy, descending into patterns of sustained and devastating mistreatment, often fueled by alcohol. You see, while not representative of all marriages, alcoholism was a significant social problem in Victorian Britain, and it frequently led to domestic abuse. A husband's excessive drinking could drain family finances, lead to violent temper tantrums, and result in physical assaults on his wife and children. While public drunkenness was condemned and severe physical violence was illegal, enforcement was inconsistent, and societal norms often protected the privacy of the home, making it difficult for wives to seek redress. Many women suffered in silence, trapped by economic dependency, social stigma, and the lack of legal protection. Their treatment by their husbands in these circumstances was brutal, often involving chronic fear and physical harm. This mainstream historical fact, the prevalence of alcoholism and its frequent link to domestic abuse, which often went unpunished, represented a grim reality for many Victorian wives. Historians still argue whether the widespread nature of male alcoholism and domestic abuse was primarily a consequence of the era's harsh working conditions and lack of social support, or if it was also exacerbated by the absolute power husbands wielded, creating an environment where their behavior could go unchecked. It's a bit like a pressure cooker with no release valve. The internal pressures build and sometimes they explode with devastating consequences. You might, as a husband struggling with drink, inflict terrible pain on your wife, then perhaps feel remorse, only for the cycle to repeat, caught in a destructive pattern that ruined both lives. Here's a quirky tidbit. Temperance movements, often led by women, gained significant momentum in the Victorian era, specifically targeting male alcohol consumption, not just for moral reasons, but because of its direct correlation with domestic violence and poverty. Imagine women campaigning fiercely in public, not for the vote, but for the right to a sober, safe home. The quiet terror, the whispered shame, and the physical scars often define the hidden lives of women trapped in abusive marriages. Your treatment of your wife in these dark instances was a stark contrast to the idealized image of the Victorian husband, revealing the deep fissures within a society that prized domestic harmony above all else, yet often failed to protect those most vulnerable within its sacred private sphere. Beyond individual moral failings and societal expectations, the treatment of wives by their Victorian husbands was often profoundly influenced by the external realities of their economic standing. This brings us to economic pressures. Burden of provision. Imagine you, a Victorian husband, waking up consumed by anxiety about your business, the fluctuating market, or the threat of unemployment. This relentless pressure to provide for your family, especially as the sole breadwinner, could profoundly shape your demeanor, your mood, and ultimately how you interacted with your wife. You see, for most Victorian husbands, the weight of financial provision was immense. Economic downturns, business failures, illness, or even simply the competitive nature of the marketplace could directly threaten your family's livelihood and social status. Unlike today, there was no comprehensive social safety net, and a loss of income could quickly plunge your family into poverty. This constant anxiety could lead to irritability, stress, and even a harshness in your treatment of your wife, who was often the immediate recipient of your frustrations. Her perceived efficiency in managing the household budget, her ability to economize, or her perceived extravagance could become points of intense contention, reflecting your underlying financial strain. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive economic pressures on Victorian husbands as sole providers, directly influenced their temperament and how they treated their wives within the home. Historians still argue whether these economic pressures primarily fostered a stoic resilience in men, driving them to greater professional efforts, or if they often led to increased domestic tensions and a harsher, more demanding approach to their wives and families. It's a bit like living under a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. It might make you more productive, but it also makes you more prone to snapping. You might find yourself meticulously scrutinizing household expenditures, complaining about small perceived extravagances, or expressing deep worry about the future, projecting your financial anxieties onto your wife, expecting her to manage the home with an almost impossible frugality. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian husbands, particularly those in precarious financial situations, would insist on their wives performing all domestic labor themselves, dismissing even one servant, to cut costs regardless of the physical toll it took on their wives. Imagine forcing your wife, perhaps a woman of delicate constitution, to take on all the arduous household chores simply to save a few shillings. The quiet weight of a man's professional failures or successes, the constant worry about putting food on the table and maintaining appearances, inevitably seeped into the home. Your treatment of your wife, therefore, was often a barometer of your own economic fortunes, demonstrating how deeply external financial realities could shape the intimate dynamics of a Victorian marriage, sometimes transforming a concerned provider into an anxious, demanding, or even harsh taskmaster. While we've explored broad themes, it's crucial to remember that the Victorian era was not a monolith, and a husband's treatment of his wife could vary dramatically based on their place in society. This brings us to regional class differences, varied behaviours. Imagine the bustling, grimy streets of industrial Manchester compared to the refined drawing rooms of London's Mayfair, or the quiet agricultural rhythms of a Cornish village. A husband's behaviour towards his wife would be profoundly shaped by these contrasting environments and their inherent social codes. You see, the ideal Victorian marriage, with its emphasis on separate spheres, rigid etiquette, and the wife as angel in the house, was largely a construct of the burgeoning middle and upper classes. Here, husbands were expected to be providers and protectors, treating their wives with a blend of paternalism and reserved affection, all within a framework of legal authority and social decorum. However, for working-class families, life was starkly different. Women often worked outside the home in factories, mills, or as domestic servants, meaning the strict separate spheres were frequently impossible to maintain. Husbands in these classes might still assert patriarchal authority, but the economic necessity of their wives' earnings meant a more pragmatic partnership. Domestic chores were often shared or neglected, and relationships could be more overtly physical, both in affection and, tragically, sometimes in violence, as discussed earlier. Social strictures on public behaviour were often looser or simply less enforced, and the struggle for survival overshadowed concerns about delicate sensibilities. This mainstream historical fact, the significant variations in husband-wife treatment across different social classes and geographical regions, highlights the complexity of Victorian marital dynamics. Historians still argue whether the greater economic interdependence in working-class marriages fostered a more egalitarian relationship despite patriarchal norms, or if it simply added another layer of burden and potential conflict for women already facing hardship. It's a bit like comparing a meticulously choreographed ballet to a lively folk dance. Both are dances, but their rules and expressions are vastly different. You might find a working-class husband walking arm in arm with his wife to the factory gates, sharing the load of childcare more directly, or expressing his affection or anger with less inhibition, a stark contrast to the polite reserve of the gentry. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some working-class communities, it was not uncommon for wives to manage the family's finances entirely, taking their husband's wages on payday and allocating funds for household expenses, a practical arrangement, born of necessity that subtly reversed the typical middle-class power dynamic. Imagine your wife managing all the family money, including your earnings, a concept that would send shivers down the spine of a proper middle-class gentleman. The quiet hum of a busy factory floor, the rough camaraderie of a public house, or the shared struggle for daily bread often define these relationships. Your treatment of your wife, depending on your class and location, could range from benevolent dictator to struggling partner, revealing how deeply societal and economic conditions influence the intimate realities of Victorian marriage. The Victorian husband was not a single archetype, but a spectrum of men shaped by their very different worlds. As our journey through the intricate world of Victorian husbands and their wives draws to a close, it becomes clear that the behaviours and expectations of that era did not simply vanish with the turn of a new century. This brings us to the legacy of patriarchy, modern echoes. Imagine looking at our contemporary relationships, our laws and our societal norms. Can you still discern the subtle, lingering imprints of those Victorian power dynamics, those unwritten rules shaping how men and women interact even today? You see, the Victorian era, for all its seeming distance, laid many of the foundational stones for modern Western gender roles and marital expectations. The legal concept of the husband as head of the household, while now largely dismantled, continues to manifest in subtle ways, from lingering assumptions about male financial responsibility to the persistence of the gender pay gap. The sexual double standard, though significantly eroded, can still be observed in differing societal reactions to male versus female infidelity, or in the disproportionate policing of female sexuality. The ideal of the angel in the house, though consciously rejected, sometimes resurfaces in societal pressures on women to prioritize domesticity, motherhood, and emotional labor, often still unpaid or undervalued. The emphasis on male stoicism and emotional reserve, too, contributes to ongoing challenges in mental health and relational intimacy for men today. This mainstream historical fact, the enduring influence of Victorian patriarchal norms on contemporary gender dynamics and marital expectations, underscores how deeply historical patterns can shape modern life. Historians still argue whether the challenges to Victorian patriarchy were primarily driven by changing economic conditions and women's increased participation in the public sphere, or if they were largely the result of sustained feminist activism that explicitly dismantled these structures. It's a bit like tracing the source of a river. You can see the main tributaries, but countless smaller streams also feed into it, shaping its flow. You might find yourself, in a moment of modern frustration, observing a lingering inequality or a subtle power dynamic in a relationship and recognizing its faint echo in the rigid structures of the Victorian past, a testament to how deeply ingrained certain societal patterns become. Here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you as we drift off. Even the design of traditional wedding rings, symbolizing the husband owning the wife, a circular bond, with her finger occupied by his gift, has roots in these Victorian-era legal and social structures, though modern interpretations have thankfully shifted dramatically. Imagine wearing a symbol that, unbeknownst to many, carries centuries of legal and social baggage. The quiet, pervasive influence of these historical norms means that even as societies evolve, the ghosts of their structures continue to whisper through generations, shaping unspoken expectations and lingering inequalities. The Victorian husband, for all his authority and duty, was a product of his time, navigating a complex web of expectations that defined his actions and interactions. His treatment of his wife, a blend of legal power, economic provision, emotional reserve, and sometimes emerging affection, was a microcosm of a society grappling with its own rapidly changing dynamics. This profound attempt to order society, however flawed or oppressive it may have been, ultimately underscores the enduring human struggle to define roles, responsibilities, and relationships. The legacy of Victorian patriarchy is not just about what husbands did, it's about the very foundations of gender, power, and partnership that continue to inform our conversations about marriage, even today. As the gaslights dim and the hum of the city outside fades, you can almost hear the rustle of a man's coat as he enters his domain, the quiet expectation of a wife's deference, and the unspoken duties that bound them both. Let the anxieties of a bygone era, the strictures and the complex realities of Victorian marriage gently recede now. The history, the knowledge, the quiet insights into how couples grappled with their roles now drifts away on the soft currents of your breath. Allow yourself to loosen your grip on the day's thoughts, letting them soften and blur. The whispers of the past are becoming fainter, merging with the calm, steady rhythm of your own heart. All the complexities, all the worries, all the curious details, they are simply sounds now, fading into the comfortable quiet. Just listen to the soft hush. Feel the peaceful stillness surrounding you, and let your mind unwind. Sweet dreams.